You're driving home from a dinner you barely spoke at, and you're thinking, of course, about the perfect thing you should have said. Not because you couldn't have said it, because by the time the words were ready, the conversation was already 3 topics ahead. This has happened to you 1,000 times, and somewhere underneath the embarrassment, you've always quietly suspected that the slow arrival of the right thought wasn't the same thing as not having one. If you're someone who thinks deeply but doesn't talk much, who notices things other people walk past, who has had teachers and bosses and partners underestimate you because you didn't perform on cue, your psychology is running on a specific kind of cognition that researchers have only recently started taking seriously. It's not slowness. It's not just introversion. It's a particular shape of intelligence that most performance environments are designed not to recognize, and it has 7 recognizable signatures. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The way our culture measures intelligence is mostly performance-based. Who speaks first in the meeting? Who answers fastest in the classroom? Who can hold court at the dinner table? Who sounds confident even when they're guessing? This bias has a name. Researchers call it the talkativeness equals intelligence assumption, and study after study has shown it's almost completely wrong. The actual cognitive processes that produce deep thinking, real synthesis, accurate pattern recognition, and sound judgment all run slower than the speech that gets rewarded. They run quieter. They run inside where nobody can see them, which means the people doing the most thinking in any given room are very often the ones doing the least talking. They've just learned over time that the room isn't going to wait for them to finish. In 2012, journalist and researcher Susan Cain published Quiet, a book that changed how psychologists talked about introvert cognition. Cain's research found that quiet thinkers weren't just shyer versions of loud ones. They were running fundamentally different cognitive processes, slower to commit to an answer, more thorough in considering alternatives, more likely to spot what was missing rather than what was present. Earlier work by developmental psychologist Jerome Kagan in the 1980s had already identified a temperament he called high reactive, kids whose nervous systems responded to stimulation more deeply than average. Kagan tracked these children into adulthood and found they often became unusually careful thinkers, deep specialists, observers, writers, scientists, not because they were anxious, because their brains were processing more input than the average brain bothers to process. What pop psychology has started calling quiet intelligence is basically this: the mind that runs deep instead of fast. Picture this. You're in a meeting, 8 people in the room. A complicated decision is being made, and everyone is offering an opinion within the first 5 minutes. You haven't said anything. You're listening, not in a polite way, in the way where you're watching the actual structure of what's being said, the assumptions underneath it, the pieces that don't quite line up. 40 minutes in, after most people have moved on to their next meeting in their head, you ask one quiet question. The room goes still for half a second, and the entire decision pivots. Nobody calls this intelligence. They probably won't even thank you for it, but you know what just happened. Sign 1. You think of the perfect response 30 minutes after the conversation has ended. You used to think this was slowness. It isn't. The cognitive process that produces sharp answers in real time is mostly retrieval. The process that produces accurate answers 30 minutes later is integration. You weren't being slow. You were doing more work than the conversation was asking for. On a slightly delayed clock. Sign 2. You'd rather understand one thing deeply than 5 things superficially. While others are collecting opinions about everything from foreign policy to the new restaurant downtown, you've spent 6 months thinking carefully about one specific question. This isn't narrowness. It's the same instinct that produces specialists, researchers, craftsmen, the people whose work eventually becomes the work everyone else cites. Sign 3. You stay quiet in groups, not because you have nothing to say, but because most of what gets said doesn't need a response. While extroverted thinkers process by talking, you process by filtering. You wait until you have something the conversation actually needs, and you offer that. The result is that when you do speak, people often listen harder than they listen to anyone else in the room. Sign 4. You notice patterns and connections across totally unrelated subjects. You'll be reading about ant colonies and suddenly understand something about your team at work. You'll watch a movie about a chess prodigy and grasp something about your own relationship. Cognitive scientists call this integrative complexity, the ability to hold multiple unrelated frameworks in your head and notice when they're describing the same pattern. Most people only see one frame at a time. Sign 5. You take longer to answer questions because you're answering more accurately. When someone asks what you think, you don't immediately produce a response. You consider whether you have a real answer, what the answer is, whether it's too simple, whether it might be wrong. The pause that other people read as hesitation is actually the moment your brain is doing the work most brains skip. Sign 6. You have a near-instant sense of when something doesn't add up before you can articulate why. A coworker pitches a plan and something in your gut goes still. A friend tells you about their new partner and you can't say what's wrong, but something is. This is the same mechanism researchers have studied in expert chess players and emergency room doctors. Pattern matching faster than language. You've been doing it your whole life. Sign 7. You're often underestimated and you don't usually correct it. People mistake your quiet for uncertainty. They assume slow answers are shallow ones. They miss what you're noticing. Rather than expending energy to perform intelligence on demand, you let the misreading site. There's something almost strategic about this. Quiet intelligence rarely needs to be the loudest in the room. It just needs the room to keep underestimating it long enough to do its work. Now, let's be honest. There is a real cost to this. People who think quietly often go unnoticed in environments that reward loud thinking. You may have been passed over for promotions, missed at parties, underestimated by partners. The same cognitive style that produces depth also produces invisibility. That's a real trade-off, and pretending it isn't wouldn't be honest. But for the people who learn to honor their own pace instead of apologizing for it, here's what you actually carry. You have a mind that other people pay consultants to develop. You can hold complexity. You can spot what's missing. You can wait. You can integrate. You can think for yourself in a culture that increasingly does not. None of these are minor abilities. They are the same abilities that produce researchers, strategists, writers, judges, designers, and the small set of people in every field whose opinions actually move things. The work isn't to talk more. The work is to trust that the silence between your sentences is doing exactly what it looks like it's doing. There's something quietly remarkable about people who have lived inside a quiet intelligence for a long time. They tend to notice things later than the room does, but more accurately than the room does. They tend to be wrong less often, even when they say less. They tend to be the ones a quieter friend turns to in a real crisis, because they don't fill the air with reassurance. They actually think about what's needed. If you have spent your life feeling slightly behind, slightly slow, slightly less impressive than the loud people who seem to know everything, this might be the moment to consider a different reading. You weren't behind. You were thinking, and the thinking takes the time it takes. You're not slow. You're not shy. You're not behind. You're someone whose mind takes the time real thinking requires and quietly arrives at things the rest of the room is still trying to skim past. There are a lot of patterns in your psychology that nobody has bothered to name yet, and that's exactly what silent awareness exists to do, one video at a time. If you want to keep finding language for the parts of yourself that have felt a little strange, please subscribe. It really does help the channel reach more people who need this.